So I think my comments are going to dovetail well with the last set of comments, partly because I want to be talking about testing and evaluating AI-enabled weapon systems. And I should just say that when I say AI-enabled weapon systems, I mean machine learning or expert systems or planning and organization algorithms that are somewhere in the warfighting capability of a weapon system. So that's what I mean by it. I don't mean autonomous. And I guess my comments would apply to autonomous weapon systems, but by and large, I'm talking about AI-enabled weapon systems. So I start with the assumption that there will be times that there might be just wars, and with the assumption that we need to think about how to justly prepare for war. So use antebellum. What do we do pre-war to minimize resort to war and minimize unjust resort to war and to minimize harming people in war? So what do we do pre-war? How do we develop weapons in a way that minimizes unjust wars and minimizes unjust fighting in war? I take it that the essential part of doing that is engaging in what I'm going to be calling TEV for the rest of my comments: testing, evaluating, verifying, and validating, or sometimes testing, evaluating, validating, and verifying, depending who you ask. So an essential part of assuring that we're justly prepared for war, that we don't start wars, contribute to security dilemma, contribute to arms race, kill civilians unnecessarily, unintentionally, or disproportionately, is engaging in TEV. TEV matters for a bunch of obvious reasons, like safety, maximizing safety. And it does that by creating predictability-based trust. So we test our weapons, and we test them, and we test them, and we test them, and eventually, hopefully, the testing produces calibrated trust in operators. So operators know when they should use the weapon and when they take some unreasonable risks in using the weapon. But in addition to predictability-based trust, TEV can contribute, when done well, to what I'm calling and what Heather Roth and David Danks call values-based trust. So when TEV embodies certain values, like jus in bello, right? So when part of our testing, evaluating, validating, and verifying is trying to make sure if we comply with in bello rules, then knowing that TEV embodied that could also build values-based trust in users. In addition to predictability-based trust and values-based trust, TEV can contribute to appropriate standards for human-machine interaction, right? So knowing how the weapon tests, how we tested it, how we evaluated it, can guide who uses the weapon, how they should use it, and when they should have that calibrated trust. In addition, TEV can and does contribute to legal review of weapon systems, and I'll say more about that later. And finally, good TEV allows for managing ethical risk. We know, again, when we should and when we should not use weapons. So how weapons manufacturers, as well as the DoD in the United States, engage in TEV is, they've been doing this for years and years and years and years. They're best practices, and by and large, it tends to work. For legacy systems, AI-enabled weapon systems present a massive amount of unique challenges to TEV. And so what I'm going to do in most of my comments is lay out those challenges and then lay out what I take to be solutions to those challenges. So the first challenge is that, unlike for legacy systems or conventional weapon systems, it's not clear what the appropriate unit of analysis is, right? So when you have a missile, you know what you're testing is the missile. But when you have an AI-enabled weapon system, i.e. you have an algorithm or a set of algorithms working together to provide, let's say, guidance, provide object recognition, provide decision support, it's not really clear. Should you just be testing that algorithm? Should you be testing it in a particular configuration, in a particular program? Should you be testing it related to the other algorithms it might be working with? So all of this makes it very hard to know how best to test an algorithm. Secondly, and a few people have already mentioned that, most AI systems most machine learning systems or any systems are built for a purpose, right? And so machine learning systems optimize for a particular purpose. Stating that purpose clearly, either by the person who's asking for the weapon or by those developing it, and making sure that those coincide, and then making sure that we develop testing to make sure that we're optimizing for the right thing, is very difficult for AI-enabled weapon systems. Related to that, it is also very hard for AI-enabled weapon systems to generalize from testing. We can test in simulations. We can even test in real-world environments. But then knowing when we should trust that our tests model all the conditions within which the system will be used is very hard to do. Related to that, and probably stemming from that, there's a well-known problem of brittleness or unpredictable failures. It is hard to know what you don't know. In fact, when it comes to AI-enabled weapon systems, many of them, not all of them, many of them have aspects of them that are opaque. They're not all opaque, they're not all black boxes, but many of them have some aspects of them that are opaque, and in that way, when they do fail, we don't know why they fail. And so it's harder to know what we should be testing for. It's harder to know how to make sure that our testing extends further. Two other things that make testing AI-enabled weapon systems difficult are piecemeal development. In the olden days, the DoD would go to a weapons manufacturer, right, like Kongsberg, and say, we need a solution, and they would build a missile system. But now, AI-enabled weapon systems are small solutions procured or sourced from startups that have 5 employees through platforms like Tradewinds and so on. And those things are embedded in other systems that might have come from large manufacturers or DARPA or the DoD itself in the United States. So that means that now you have algorithms strung together in various ways in a decision-making chain, and let's say in a targeting chain. And I should point out, targeting is not pressing the button, right? Targeting starts 6 months before the actual engagement with collection of surveillance and intelligence and discussions and commander's intent and various alternative engagements and so on. And so all of that engages algorithms that are sourced from all sorts of sources. Finally, and this is not yet a serious problem for kinetic AI-enabled weapon systems, although it is for cyber, and that is that some systems might be dynamic or open. Simply put, the machine learning model keeps on being retrained as it goes. No kinetic system uses that today, at least not that I know of, but cyber systems most certainly do. But when that becomes available, and I'm sure it will at some point, you can imagine the difficulty of testing a system whose model is constantly updating itself. So with all of this in mind, I just wanted to provide, I think, 7 or 8 best practices for doing testing and evaluating for AI-enabled weapon systems. First, we should be doing TEV from the beginning, integrating it from cradle to grave. We're already doing this for legacy systems, but it's that much more important that the testing, evaluating, validating, and verifying starts from day one, from the idea, from the person who comes and says, I need this solution, through the development, throughout procurement, and throughout fielding. That's incredibly important. To do that, we need to have a principled and modular TEV approach. By principled, I mean we need to know what sorts of a change in an algorithm or what sort of a change in an algorithm configuration sets off a new process. Because algorithms change, how we use them, where we embed them changes. And so what sort of a change would basically set off a new testing process? And of course, we can't engage in a testing process all from the beginning, so that's why I say modular. We need to have a TEV process that's modular in the sense we can take bits and pieces and redo that element. Obviously, TEV needs to enable legal review in the United States. When they engage in legal review, it does work parallel to TEV. It does start from cradle, and that should be the case for AI-enabled weapon systems as well. I think it's incredibly important to get better testing data. The training data for algorithms that are publicly procured from startups are sourced from the civilian population very often. And so the DoD doesn't have access to that. And the DoD has all sorts of limitations on getting testing data that neither the civilian industry nor, let's say, the Chinese competitors have. And so getting our hands on testing data, at least for the US, is a really serious problem. Data that is different than training data that the algorithm has never seen before to make sure that the algorithm is working right. In addition to that, obviously, I think AI-enabled systems have to be gradually fielded. You first field them in places where you have absolute confidence they're going to work, and then slowly move on to places where they might not. This is what Jay Pinellas, the head of CDAO, calls making sure that we gracefully fail, as opposed to kill 1,000 people because our AI system failed, right? Fifthly, we need to have transparency and explainability. Everybody says that. I think the key lesson here is that the sort of explainability I need as an operator is different than the sort of explainability that a tester needs. Clearly, the tester needs higher level of explainability. And so I think we need to start having serious conversations, not about we need explainability, but what type of explainability for whom, what's the purpose of it, and then how do we provide it? I think for TEV, we need the highest level of explainability. Sixthly, we want TEV to define our operational envelopes, i.e. where we certain the system's going to work. Where do we have a high level of confidence the system is going to work? And TEV should help us create red lines. I don't think the question should be whether we should have AI-enabled weapons or not. The question should be, what are the red lines for their use? And TEV can be and should be an essential part of asserting or creating those red lines. Lastly, the last two best practices is TEV should drive certification schemes. So lessons from the testing should tell us how should we train and certify operators on those systems. And obviously, given that it's a piecemeal development, we should have testing in various configurations. So we should test algorithms in various systems, in various programs, and in various configurations. So the thing I'm going to leave you with is to say that I do think that it's incredibly important that we justly prepare for war so that we absolutely minimize when we resort to war, when we resort to unjust war, and whether or not we can make sure that we respect in-bello regulations. I think AI-enabled weapon systems do create unique obstacles to that just preparation because they create unique obstacles to testing and evaluating. But I do think that with some best practices that probably go beyond my 8, but starting with those 8, we can get closer to good testing and evaluating. Thank you.